All right, let's flip the field, Logan, and take a look at this Arizona defense. They've got a bunch of really talented players. Probably the biggest star is Budda Baker, their safety, but they've also got a bunch of unheralded type of guys who just play their faces off. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of what Washington wants to be in terms of a defense that just plays hard, plays fast, plays physical. Dan Quinn said earlier this week about his defense that they're not where he wants them yet, but it's getting better, which is kind of what we've seen when we've watched the tape, and we talked about that more on Tuesday. But Jonathan Gannon has done a tremendous job in his first year and change here of setting a tone with this Arizona defense. What do you see when you watch them on tape from how they play, both schematically and from that kind of physicality and intention standpoint?
Yeah, they play hard. They play hard as all outdoors. And I think, like you said, there's nobody out there that's like, a household name. Budda Baker is kind of their guy, and they have some guys on the edge. They've got David Collins, who was a first-round pick a couple years ago. He's a good player, but not great. He's making a position switch. He's moving outside linebacker. I think they're two inside linebackers because they're White and Mac Wilson are good players. Like they kind of embody that what you're talking about. They're flexible. They can blitz. They can cover pretty well. They're fast to the football. Gardeck, the other outside linebacker, is kind of very in the same mold. He's an undersized special teams guy that has cultivated some pass rush and has become a very productive player for them. I think he had like 3 sacks against LA and an interception. So interception against Detroit. So obviously being very productive. But I do think a lot of the production, excuse me, stems from the style of defense that they're playing. And we talked about, Todd Bowles early in the season being very complicated. We talked about Lou Anarumo in terms of some of the coverage stuff he did being very complicated. This is the most complicated defense Jayden will play against this year. So far this year. They are really fun to watch from that standpoint. They bring a ton of fire zones, where it's hey, we're showing pressure here. We're dropping the outside linebackers out. That's why Zaven Collins and Gardeck are so good, because they can kind of get into space and cover. We're going to have 8 guys at the line of scrimmage. Sometimes we're bringing 8. Sometimes we're bringing 4 in simulated pressures, and everybody else is dropping out. So their ability to get from pressure looks, seemingly pressure looks, to normal coverage structures, bring 5-man rushes, and kind of make sure you've got enough droppers out in the right positions. You can tell they coach those guys to drop really well because they're in good spots. They're reading quarterback eyes. They're getting good depth. They're relating to number 1, relating to number 2. It's tough. And so you see, I think they have, I don't know how many interceptions they have this year, but they've accumulated quite a few turnovers and interceptions, and it's just quarterbacks just throwing it straight to dudes because they didn't know they were there. They were you should be open. You're not open. Here's the football, turnover, right? And so I think that's something coming out of this game, because there's no killer in terms of one-on-one matchup. Everybody feels very manageable. There's no Trey Hendrickson this week. It really comes down to the scheme and how well these guys execute the scheme and how evolved it's gotten. Last year or 2 years ago when they played them, it was pretty simple. It was cover 3, maybe a little cover 6, but we're very straightforward. And now you see kind of, this is year 2 of the defense, year 3 of the defense. Yeah, and and it's really blossomed, and it's hard to manage. And that's, there was for one of our other shows, they were talking about how someone predicted them to be the worst defense in the NFL, but they're 19th, and when you look at them, it's scheme. The scheme is excellent, and the way those guys are bought into the scheme, because they're able to create pressures with limited rushers, we talked about, simulated pressures, overloads, stunts. They brought a really cool pressure against the Detroit Lions that led to an interception. So basically they brought a 6-man rush with 2 zone droppers. And this is something that the Indianapolis Colts used to do, is when the quarterback opens to the side, the 2 droppers just sprint to the side that he's looking to take away underneath. And then they rotate the coverage. So they're able to get to 4 over 3 essentially with less coverage players. So one half of the field is completely open, but it doesn't matter because the pressure is going to get there and you can't. So that type of stuff is tough. And I think, obviously Kliff is going to need an excellent protection plan. They're going to need a lot of solutions. And I think the screen game will be really interesting this week, how effective it's going to be. Because sometimes it looks like they're going to blitz, they drop out, there's dudes standing right where the screen's going to be completed. You know what I'm saying? you don't know on the snap where they're going to end up. And obviously there's some indications from coverage and rotation, but they're good at hiding that stuff. So I think this is going to be a really significant test for Jayden, and it feels like a game where like you want to make sure you're running the football very effectively and being super efficient, because I think you can. I think when you look at Detroit in the first half of that game, they basically were like, we're not throwing the ball. We're going to run the ball, and they couldn't stop them because they're not super big up front. They're not super physical. Even the linebackers I mentioned are really good. They're a little undersized, kind of safety body types. So I would say, how do we get to running the football? How do we get to deleveraging Jayden? How do we keep him out of these kind of really complicated third down structures? That would be my kind of my high level game plan notes going into this thing.
Yeah, so there's a lot there to obviously double click on. Let's start off with where you ended though in running the football, because one thing that I'll add that we'll circle back to is they also match really well. Like there's a couple of times, or there's a lot of times I should say, when I'm watching them and I'm like, is this man? Is this zone? And it's like, oh no, it's zone, but they latch onto receivers, and it's not your Madden bubble zone. Like
they're good. They're good. They're a good defense. They're
Yeah.
good defense, and they present challenging things for a quarterback.
Especially one who hasn't seen a ton of that at a high level so far. Although, Jayden did pretty well against Alabama, and that's the most complicated defense he might see in his life, which was kind of a fun thing to go back and watch when we were watching him during the draft process. But the reason I just mentioned that is it would seem that the way to avoid having to deal with all of that, all the pressures, all of the coverage things, everything we just talked about, is to run the football. And the one thing that Arizona hasn't faced this year so far is a rushing quarterback. And so that is something that I think is
Josh
going to be
Allen.
Yeah, but they don't. I guess
run him. Yeah, I mean he's special. He's like, but I would classify him in kind of this, like Jayden Daniels is aspiring to be Josh Allen in terms of so this is, I'm really glad you brought this up, because if you watch that game, there are times where it's 3rd and 15 and Josh gets a little bit confused and he just runs, because even these zone droppers, they're not always looking at him. They're dropping to spots, and he's able to run for first downs. So I do think, like, to your point, like Josh Allen, and obviously he's special because of what he can do from the pocket, how they've constructed that offense. But I think this is a good opportunity. If you're a little bit confused, like, it's okay to run. You know what I mean? Like, don't, like, because again, like there's the Jared Goff one, like he's standing back. I think he throws 2 interceptions versus Arizona, right? He's back there. He's looking at, like, and this keeps them in the game, these 2 interceptions. I'm talking about Arizona now versus Detroit. He's back there. I understand exactly what he's looking at, and the tight end breaks across the plugger's face, and there's a dropper just standing. Like the dropper didn't even move. He's just standing right in the zone and makes the interception. And the other interception is very similar. It's just, if you're not sure, I would say don't throw it, because they really are opportunistic in that way, and they're going to make you hurt if you're not careful.
So, yeah, no, absolutely. And the reason I bring up the running quarterback thing, though, and kind of, I'll say, exclude Allen, like, obviously the scramble stuff is hugely important. But in the regular season, Buffalo doesn't run him by design nearly as much, maybe in the red zone. But obviously Washington will. And I'm curious how that affects, like, Arizona's run fits and some of the things like that, when all of a sudden you have to account for the quarterback run game. But where are the opportunities to run the football for Kliff? What kind of runs have worked against Arizona this year, and where? And then I guess the last piece of that too is, like, how does Austin Eckler's absence affect the efficacy of this run game, or do we think that the runs that they will run are going to be Brian Robinson runs anyway, and we're looking much more like week 2 against the Giants, where he had a $150, than last week where he's averaging 1 point whatever yards a carry?
That's a really good question, and we probably should have prepped this a little bit more. But, like, so for example, the Detroit Lions are just like, put your mouthpiece in. Here's an extra lineman. Like, we are going to out physical you. Like, good luck. And that's what their philosophy is, right? LA, they want to run duo, and they kind of got it shoved in their face, because they're all lines banged up. They're not healthy. Like, it makes sense, right? They're not physically where they need to be to do it. I think the one group that I would kind of model the run game after is the Bills, because they have James Cook, right?
Yeah.
Is that his name?
Yeah.
And they run a lot of stuff from the gun, and they do a really good job of that. And I think, like, creating space, like, if I'm Kliff, I'm watching that film pretty closely, because how did they create space? How do they relate to these wide splits? And that's what Fred said the other day, because I guess he played in the defense. I forget where it was. I think it was probably here in Washington, where they ran a lot of zone pressures. And he's like, if you widen the splits out, it makes it super hard for us to disguise, because we do have to relate to those wide splits. So I'd probably go look at the Bills and say, how are they positioning? What are their formations are in? Because James Cook, even on, like, screens, like little check, not even screens, like little check down kind of like outs and flats and flares. Like it kind of became an analogous for their run game. And then they do like this little cool like trap from the gun, and they run but he killed him. He killed him. And I think like that's something that I would probably look at and say, if they're going to respect our our receivers, like let's take an advantage, much in the same way that Kliff did versus the New York Giants, right? Like kind of, we're going to spread you out. We're going to get these favorable boxes and we're going to go get it. So I think that's probably the way I would look at it in terms of like teams that have been effective, is because again, like it's a complicated defense. They're physical. They play aggressively to the football, but if we spread them out, we get guys in space. I think that's going to be to our advantage. Now, you mentioned the Austin Eckler thing. I think that's going to be really hard to fill those shoes. Austin's done a really good job, like we talked about on the preview show, of every time he touches it, not every time, but over the course of a game, he'll find you an explosive play. So he had the kick return, he had the explosive touchdown run last week, he had a couple of big plays against New York, and I think that's what, and even against Tampa Bay, he took a check down for 30 yards. You know what I mean? Like it makes it so much easier to run an offense when you have a guy with that skill set. And so not having that and losing a little bit of that offensive juice, I think is going to be really interesting, because now it puts the onus on Kliff, it puts the onus on Jayden to help find and manufacture some of those explosive plays. And again, like we talk about explosive plays all the time from an analytics perspective. If you get 3 explosive plays, usually you're scoring 3 touchdowns. And so now you've taken away 3 of them from your offense. So what are you going to do? And so who's going to step up into that role is going to be really, really interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, because I looked this up yesterday as I was talking about Eckler on the radio show, we just got in the news, and I was like, let me quickly sort out these explosive runs and look at all the 10-plus yard rushes on the season. Most of them are Jayden on scrambles. So he is still the primary driver of their explosive plays, and we talked about how valuable his ability to keep them on schedule is, but Eckler obviously has had a couple of big ones in some of the screen game. This from Next Gen Stats I thought was really interesting, Logan. Jayden Daniels has the average, or the second quickest time to throw among qualified passers, 2.43 seconds. And he's attempted a quick pass, which is classified as under 2.5 seconds, at the highest rate in the league in 2024. 59% of his passes coming out in 2.5 seconds or less. But here's where it matches up with the Cardinals. The Cardinals have allowed the second most yards per attempt and tied for the 4th most touchdowns against quick passes this season. So they're giving up 8.2 yards an attempt in quick game / screen / anything that's out and under 2.5, and they've given up 3 touchdowns on those. So I think that's an interesting element of like, another way to avoid the pressures, avoid the rush, is get the ball out quickly. Obviously, if you're going quick and they drop a zone dropper right in your path, that can be a recipe for disaster. But if you can get that part right, and this is where I wonder about Kliff's ability to, not wonder about, like, I'm excited about Kliff's ability to use formations to kind of save himself and set the offense up for success. If you can get that stuff right, it does feel, based off those numbers, albeit a small sample size, just 3 games, that there are opportunities here in the screen game, in the quick game, to slip a tackle and then go make a big play.
Yeah, and in the Detroit game, for example, like a lot of their early completions are a quick game, because usually you're playing some type of off. They are like a zone-based team. They do play match, like you were saying. They do play a little bit of man, but they're like zone. And so if you can kind of take advantage of some of those quick-hitting, free access plays, like, why not? And I think that's a really good point, and I think it's going to be awesome to see how they kind of utilize it. Because again, like Jonathan Gannon's a smart dude. It's his defense. He's not calling it, but it's his defense. They're going to have a plan for our quick game. Like every team, like they've seen how effective we've been with like these screens and the RPOs, and they're going to have a solution. Like the thing about that I think that is maybe underrated in this, and I just thought about it right now, is that Brian Johnson was with him for a long time in Philly. Right. And like, I think he's going to have the keys to the test, but I also know that they were one of the highest RPO teams when he was in Philly, with Jalen Hurts, and he's going to have a solution to stop some of the RPO stuff like that. I think it's going to be very effective. So I think that is the kind of the ultimate chess match. Like, to your point, is like, they know what we know well, and we know what they know well. Like, what is our solution kind of counterpoint to get there? And obviously there's an execution element, like we got to execute better than they do. But I think that's why these matchups get so interesting as the week goes on because you realize these relationships, you realize these connections, you see the holes in what they do. Because again, it's not a perfect defense. Like when you're bringing pressure the way they're bringing it, you are susceptible to people reading it out and making big plays. Like Josh Allen scored 35 points on him, and he's a special player, obviously, but there are avenues to score a lot of points. And so I think that like as you go, it's just like maybe you got the right play called at the right time and it ends up being an explosive play, and that's really kind of how they won the Cincinnati game. Is they just were like always in the right play, and if they weren't in the right play, Jayden Daniels made a play, like you said, like in terms of explosive scrambles and runs, like that's going to be a huge part of this game, I think. And as long as he stays healthy, he doesn't take any big hits, I think, and plays efficient football, makes good decisions, there's definitely an avenue for the Commanders' offense to stay as hot as they've been the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, God, you imagine Tress Way is just like, all right, I guess I'm not punting again. That'd be cool. I do really think the Eckler thing is huge, though. I'm thinking back to some of the big plays that they gave up, and there's one play that's just a stupid Josh Allen play in the Bills game where they come with the pressure. Allen somehow gets out, like shakes off a tackle in the pocket, gets out. James Cook had went to block. The guy that he was going to block winds up being in man-to-man on him. I think it was like a green dog situation. And then that guy goes and blitzes when he sees that James Cook is blocking. Cook leaks out. Josh Allen runs out, finds Cook for what turns out to be a 20-yard gain that should have been a minus 12. So that's fun. Stafford,
when he's in his bag, he is the most fun quarterback to watch. I know people say like he is just like
he's the only one that can compete with Pat on that level.
Dude, it's like I'm big, I'm fast, I've got a tremendous arm, I'm seeing stuff really well. It's like good luck.
I think there was some stat that like he has the highest percentage of completions within like a yard of the sideline. Like his ability to just dot guy, like that's for some reason that just popped in my mind. I think that's a real number. If not, nobody cares. But like his ability to, and think about watching him though, like how often is he rolling and just finds a guy on the side? Like not talking about the receiver on the sideline, like he is basically out of bounds.
Yes.
And he throws. And like he has the highest number or percentage of those of anybody in the league. So yeah. But also I think of like there was a play where Stafford saw a blitz and they released the back and he's able to loft it. And like, but that's Matt Stafford, right? Yeah. His ability to see things quickly, get the ball out to a back in space and let that back do the work generates an explosive play. So it really does come down to Jayden's ability to see it, which like, duh, he's the quarterback. That's always going to be the case. But it is the kind of thing where as these tests get harder and harder, and from a schematic standpoint, for all the reasons that we've discussed, this is probably the hardest one he's had yet. Can he continue the high level of execution that he's had? And specifically, like, can he not make the mistakes that he hasn't made so far? No interceptions through 3 games. They haven't lost a fumble, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that really, because that's the one thing I get worried about watching this defense is they do seem to get people a little bit confused in terms of like, oh, I didn't expect someone to be there. And Jayden is a guy that, through his tremendously well-documented preparation is like he prides himself on knowing where people are going to be. And you can tell like, and I will say this too, like this is another important point. Like I thought Lou Anarumo came out with a little bit more conservative approach because of how Jayden is as a runner. So maybe Jonathan Gannon adopts something similar. I don't know. But if this defense is at its best, it's going to be hard on third down for him. And so like what are the tools, like you said, for Kliff to kind of make it so it's a little bit cleaner, that they can't disguise it as long, and can Jayden make sure that he's prepped for it? And sometimes you can't be prepped for something until you see it for the first time. So that's why this game feels kind of like I don't want to say a trap game, but it feels a little bit sketchy because of what they do defensively and how hard it is to deal with, even for the offensive line, which has played really well. It's just hard. Like, are you a rusher? Yes. Are we? And then we gotta check this. We got to fan. We gotta squeeze back. All that kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting challenge. And again, they're not the most physically gifted defense I've ever seen, but they are schemed up really well. So, and then I do think offensively, I do think our defense kind of matches up okay with them in a way that we haven't seen over the last couple of weeks of the season. So really curious to see how that matchup goes as well. So the more you talk about it, the more you're like, oh, this is going to be a lot of fun to watch, which is always exciting. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, Arizona might be 1-2, but they played Buffalo really tough. They beat the absolute crap out of the Rams, and then they played Detroit really tough. So their 2 losses come against 2 teams that we expect to see playing deep into January. and they beat the absolute tar out of a team that we expect because of injuries, probably not, but is extremely well coached, and they still won by a billion. So definitely going to be fun. You'll be on the call, so enjoy that. We will reconvene 7:30 is when we've been doing the live streams for the late games. I'm not exactly sure who's going to be on it yet, so I need to go figure that out. But 7:30, we'll have the Take Command instant reaction show on YouTube at the Team 980 and at 106.7 The Fan, and then we will put it in audio form in your podcast feeds immediately after. So Sunday night, you will have an instant reaction show, and then Logan and I will be back on Tuesday for a film breakdown. Until then, again, all the latest news live on the radio. Check us out, Hoffman Show on the Team 980 from 4 to 7. That also streams live on YouTube at the Team 980 if you'd prefer. And the podcast on demand anytime, anywhere. Just search The Hoffman Show. Thanks so much for watching and listening. If you made it this far, you haven't subscribed, clearly you like it enough to make it this far, so go ahead and do that, and we'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.